Do you have trouble with compressors? Are you uncertain where to use them and how to use them? Then this video is for you. Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about compressors. As you could see from that little intro, we're going to talk about how do you read a compressor, how do you use a compressor, just the basics. But I'm also going to explain some tips that you can use to just make your life a little bit easier, which not a lot of people discuss. Just before we get into that, I do want to say that I have spots open for private lessons. If you're interested in that, you can find all of the information on my website, projector.blog, and you'll be able to contact me there. So if you're interested in that, just shoot me a message and then we can arrange something. But for now, let's get into the video. So this is the project. You can see we have a simple drum loop here, a very dynamic, punchy drum loop with a lot of difference between the volumes in the highest hits and the lowest hits. And we have our recording track here. Before we get into actually using the compressor and opening up the compressor, let's talk a little bit about the main problem that you're trying to tackle with a compressor. So when you're compressing things, what you're looking at is the volume difference between loud hits in your sound or in your signal and quiet hits. So in this case, you can see it's very prominent. We have these two hits, which are a great example. You can see this hit is definitely a lot louder than this one. This might become a problem when you're trying to mix this sound into a full track. You might find a volume that works well for this hit and you're able to nicely hear it in the track, but then this hit here, this little extra drum hit, just is completely buried behind all of the other elements within your track. You could also try to find a volume where this hit might come through nicely, but then this thing is going to be way too loud. What we would like to have is a plugin that can help us diminish these loud hits so that the overall difference between volume between this one and this one is a lot less, and therefore you can set a more appropriate volume for the track and maybe have both hits come through nicely within the mix. That's really what the compressor is doing here. The compressor is trying to take out all of the loudest hits and just diminish them in volume. So here's a compressor. This might look very complicated, and that's because this particular plugin is very complicated, but there's just a few parameters that we're going to focus on, which are the threshold, the ratio, the release, and the attack. Those four are the main parameters that you're going to find within any compressor, basically. So the reason why I've chosen this compressor is because I really like this kind of graph here. There's a lot of compressors that show this graph, especially these two lines here. But this one also tells you exact volumes of that graph. So let's look at this graph before we dive into the actual workings of the compressor. As you can see, we're looking at basically a volume mapping graph. So what that means is that we have a volume down below here and a volume up here, and we're looking at, okay, at minus 12 dB we're going to go to minus 12 dB. At minus 24 dB we're going to go to minus 24 dB. So that's here to there. You can see we're looking at where this at this point is on the graph, and then we map that to this point on the graph here. And for all of these points up until minus 12, we can see that that's one-to-one mapping, right? So a minus 24 goes to a minus 24, minus 25 goes to minus 25, so it's one-to-one. Everything up until minus 12 is, as I said, one-to-one mapping. You can see above there, it's a one-to-infinite mapping, which is called limiting. And that's because I've set a ratio of infinity, and that was just for me to show easily how this graph was working. It's just a little bit more easy to explain it like that than when it's not set to infinity. So for example, say it's set to like 4, it's a little bit harder to show you what the values are actually doing. So at minus 6 it's not going to a value that's easily recognizable on this graph. So that was just for the example. But now knowing this, we can actually start to talk about the parameters. So this threshold determines where the ratio is taking place. Again, if I set it to infinity, it will also determine what the maximum volume is that will be mapped to by the compressor. So you can see I can set it very low, and all of the loudest volumes here, anything above minus 30 dB, will be mapped to minus 30 dB. But going up, I can set that for minus 12, minus 6, minus 9 in this case. You can see the exact values here. So this determines at what point in volume is the compressor going to activate. The compressor is going to activate for everything above a certain volume, and what it will do is it will actually multiply all of that volume above it with a ratio. So in this case it's infinite, and therefore anything above a certain volume will be set to that specific volume, but it doesn't have to be that extreme. You can set, for example, a ratio of, in this case, 4:1, which means that for every 4 dB above this target volume, above this minus 11.2 dB, we will get 1 dB of extra output. So it takes 4 dBs to output 1 dB of volume. The compressor is not an instantaneous process. It does not immediately, once detecting a certain level, start acting upon that level. It needs some time to start and to stop acting. And those times are controlled with attack and release. So the attack time determines how long it takes for the compressor to actually start compressing the sound, to actually start applying that multiplication so that the volume is reduced. It's doing a multiplication by a ratio, right? So it's 1/4, which means that it's actually multiplying by 1/4 or 0.25, right? So we're doing a multiplication, but by a value that's lower than 1, and therefore we're actually diminishing the overall volume that we're outputting. So don't get confused there with the terms multiplication. We're not actually increasing it, we're actually decreasing it through multiplication of a volume by a value that's lower than 1. So this attack time determines how long it takes before that to happen, but it also determines how long it takes for the threshold to actually start detecting things. So if I record this with this compressor playing, we can start to see that if I turn up the attack, the transients, the very start of these sounds, these little bits here, are going to come through without any processing on it. What you'll see is it will start to duck, for example, from here, and with higher attack values from here, and with higher ones from here. But you'll also see that the overall gain reduction that is occurring, which this graph will show, that the gain reduction actually becomes less because these peaks are no longer being detected. So it has basically this double influence over, in the sense that it's not only not compressing these peaks, but it's also compressing the stuff that it compresses a lot less, because it's detecting a lot less volume. Now that we know the effect of the attack, let's talk a little bit about the release. And the release is basically doing the opposite. It tells you how long it takes for the compressor to relax again. This has a little bit more impact on, for example, quiet stuff right after a transient. A good example of that is this stuff here. If I turn the release down a lot, this isn't going to be compressed as much as if I were to turn it up longer and longer. You can see that it's not really affecting the transients itself, it's more affecting all of the stuff happening after the transient. It is therefore often said that the release timing has effect on the groove of your sound, because it allows you to determine how much of the details which happen right after a transient actually get compressed, and how many of those details are not being compressed, and therefore overall have their volume obviously relatively higher. So again, I'm going to record this and just play with the release knob, and you'll see what kind of influence it has on the sound. There are a lot more controls that I can go over, but for this video I just want to keep it very, very simple, and I now want to actually cover something else which I think is a little bit more important, and that's actually how you would use a compressor and when would you use a compressor. I've already said when you would want to use a compressor, when you have very big differences between hits within a signal or transients within a signal or certain parts of a sound, and you want to change that so it's easier to mix them in. But it's not really that easy, because sometimes you have to consider that, for example, in this case a hi-hat is a lot less loud than a snare drum. So it might sound unnatural to compress it to the point where this hi-hat has the same loudness as this snare drum. What I like to do as a tip here is to see if you really need the compression, is to see if you can find a compression setting that is too extreme, and then you dial it back later. And then you try to find if that dialed in version really sits better in your mix, or if now too much stuff is coming through. You can then repeat this process of dialing back until you find the setting that works within your mix, and then you can see, is it really necessary that I'm doing this compression, or am I just taking 1 or 2 dB off in some cases, in very particular cases. Then it might not really matter to compress a sound like that. Then how would you actually set up the compressor? My recommendation is to start with threshold and ratio, and then have very specific attack and release settings when you're setting it up, so that you can make good decisions for both the ratio and the threshold. Then you can start to worry a little bit more about the timing. Now let's go over quickly how I would set up for this particular drum loop. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with an attack as fast as possible, and I want to set a release roughly so that each individual hit is going to trigger the compressor, but we don't have the release going off so fast that parts of the sound, for example like this, are no longer being affected by the compressor. So around 100 milliseconds I like for snappy drum loops like these. You might need to see if your drums are a lot longer, then I would recommend a longer release time. And if they are a lot shorter, if you're working with very, very short sounds, then I would recommend a shorter release time. Within this graph, when the gain reduction is actually showing when it's playing, you can actually see if the end of the release timing isn't being clipped off too much. Right now we can see individual hits, but if I go back to 0, you can see there is it's not going back to 0 before a new trigger is happening, and the compressor again starts to reduce the gain. Now that I have my attack and release set for now, I can worry about the threshold and the ratio. And the way I like to do that is with my second tip is to actually record and see what is happening. This allows me to visually see what the waveform is actually going to look like when I'm compressing, without having to imagine what is happening here. So I record, and then I set my threshold and release or ratio. And for now I don't want to be too extreme, I just want to slightly turn down these higher transient there. You can see we have reduced the overall volume here. Now this is at 0 dB, so just looking at this waveform with regards to this waveform is not really going to tell you much. So I'm going to consolidate this recording, and then I'm going to set it right here to 0 dB. Now if I make them equally sized here in Ableton, you will be able to see the actual difference in that all of this extra stuff here, and you can see this hi-hat over here, these lower hi-hats, this stuff here, this is all being turned up in volume now. Because what we're technically doing is we're turning these down and then turning the whole loop back up. So now you can imagine that this is a little bit easier to mix just because it is less dynamic. So you will be able to find a better target volume, which allows you to set it up so that you can hear both this transient here as well as this little hi-hat here, and all of the details in, for example, this part and anything that's basically not transient information. Now I said that we were going to re-evaluate our attack and release settings, and that's what I like to do at this point. What I also like to do is set an output gain right now so that we have that we go back to 0 dB. And the way I like to do that is just by going back a little bit and by looking at my output gain here of the recording, or the gain that I'm missing to 0 dB, and I can just set that to this right here, and now we should have it automatically go to 0 dB. I consolidate this, it consolidates to 0 dB, meaning that it's our normalized signal that we can now work with. For the attack and release, what I want to do is I want the compressor to relax a little bit more. I don't want it to work that much. And the real way that you do that is just by setting up a little bit of an attack so that some of the transients come through a little bit more, and we keep some of the punch of the original loop in here. Now, as I discussed before, changing the attack will have very big results on the actual volume that we're outputting here and the amount of gain reduction that we're doing. So you could see me immediately turn down the output gain to compensate. Now if I record this, you can see if I've set up our output gain correctly. No, we haven't. So let's set this to 0 and quickly reset up our output gain. You can see now the effect is a little bit less diminished, but you can also hear the compressor working a lot less. What you can also see is that our transients, our very starts, right here and right there, aren't being compressed as much, which is obviously because of the attack. That's something you might want, that's something you might not want. If you really want to crush this and really want to make it sound like every hit is nicely sitting within the mix, I would recommend keeping the attack at 0 and just setting it up like we had it set up before. For this little bit of extra punch and this little bit of less aggressive compression, I do really like a little bit of an attack on this loop. That just depends on the mix, depends on what other material you're working with. More aggressive songs, you'll see stronger attacks and release timings. The final thing that I want to say about release timing is that you can set the release timing so short that some oscillations might start to trigger it. What that means is, say that we have an oscillation like this, right, where we can see we have one oscillation basically in terms of length. It might be that at these 0 points, if you set your release really fast, like a few milliseconds, that this low dip where it's lower in volume is enough for the compressor to completely stop, and then with this next oscillation it will again trigger the threshold and it will go up again, which means that it will start to compress only the tops and bottoms of oscillations in terms of the volume. And therefore it will kind of almost like a soft clipper squish the top and the bottom of these oscillations, of these single oscillations. It introduces distortion into your sound. With that it sounds like this. I'll set it to 0 attack so you can really hear the effect again. It's maybe a little bit hard to see, but from that graph you can see that there's individual spikes for some of the individual oscillations. There you can see it. If I zoom in a bit, let me try to get that. Yeah, you can see the individual oscillations triggering the compressor here, right? You see a whole bunch of little spikes, which means that for every oscillation it's just squashing the top and the bottom of that oscillation, which is basically soft clipping at that point. That's how I consider compression, how I would do compression. I do want to say that it's really hard to get the details right, because it's just really hard to hear. If you really want to know what you're doing with a compressor, you would need a treated room and just a lot of experience. So the final tip that I want to give you here is to keep experimenting with a compressor. Don't think because you don't know what you're doing with a compressor that you shouldn't be using it. You definitely should try to get familiar with a compressor, with the sound, even if your system is not maybe capable of producing all of the details that you might want for you to be able to actually hear what the compressor is doing. If you're working on small speakers in an untreated room like me, then it's very hard for you to dial in those exact settings that you might want. So this is going to be the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it helpful. As I said again, I just want to quickly push my private lessons. If you're interested in that, and there's links in the description to my website where you can find information on that. I would also urge you to join my Discord if you want to interact with my community, interact with all of the other subscribers and people that I have here that watch my videos, and discuss your music, ask for feedback, promote your releases. You do whatever you want. We have a channel for basically everything. But for now I want to say, if you enjoyed the video, please let me know by leaving a like. If you're new here, subscribe and consider turning on notifications with the little bell icon so YouTube sends you a message whenever I upload something. But for now this is going to be it, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.